From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Wisconsin Supreme Court strikes down the state's legislative maps while pledging to enforce political neutrality. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Colin Levy and columnist Kim Strassel. The new 4-3 liberal majority on the Wisconsin Supreme Court is already flexing its new judicial muscle, with a ruling on Friday saying that the state's Assembly and Senate seats are unconstitutional because they include districts that are not contiguous. Let's listen to a clip of the Speaker of the Assembly, Robin Vos, last week on PBS Wisconsin.
Everybody in Wisconsin knows that this is a farce. They have already decided they're going to draw new maps because Janet Protasiewicz, for the first time in the history of the country, predetermined cases when she was running for an election. That's wrong. But we already know what's happening. So it's not some kind of a big mystery that we don't know we're going to get maps. Let's remember that Republicans have had this majority in the chamber for 30 years with 2 years exception, and that was under maps run by a court, maps run by the legislature, maps run by a federal court. We're going to win again in 2024 because we have better candidates and a better message.
Colin, what's your read of this decision by the state Supreme Court? 235 pages in all, including the dissents. And then where the debate goes from here on what Wisconsin's legislative map should look like.
Right. I mean, there's no question, Kyle, that this was a completely political decision. We knew it was coming. And when Justice Protasiewicz was running for office, she did say that these maps were rigged, so everyone was expected that this was the way that it was going to go. I think this decision, nonetheless, was a very interesting read because of the way the four progressive justices sort of turned themselves into knots trying to explain what they were trying to do here. The issue, as you know, they overturned these earlier maps on the grounds that the maps aren't contiguous, which means if you look at a districting map, you can see little pieces that are sort of floating away from the district that they otherwise belong to. And that was the grounds that they used to overturn these and say that that violates the Wisconsin Constitution. Problem is, those little islands have been floating around on Wisconsin maps for a very long time and have been previously ruled by the Wisconsin Supreme Court to be perfectly reasonable under the Wisconsin Constitution. And it has a little bit to do here with the way that Wisconsin generally handles its districting and annexation laws. I mean, the reason that the maps aren't contiguous is that they have these weird annexation laws that allow cities and villages to annex townships bit by bit and leaving small pieces carved off. And that's the way it's always been. I mean, every single map, including the ones that Democrats drew when they had the full majorities in the 1970s and 1980s, were like that because that's just the way towns, annex and expand. So they're using this excuse to say that the maps are not constitutional when the real issue that the Democrats and the progressive justices were concerned with was the overall balance of power in the state legislature, which they see is geared toward Republicans, and they want to see what they can do to change that. So they're using this as legal pretense. And then, as I'm sure we'll discuss more later, they do get into the fact that they will consider partisan remedies as they begin to address what the new maps will look like.
If listeners want to see what some of these little pieces of territory look like, you can go to Google Maps and you can type in municipalities in Wisconsin and it will pull up the maps of them. So Racine, for example, is the one I have in front of me. And there's a little piece of Racine floating to the northwest of the rest of Racine, not connected to the group. So it's kind of interesting, Kim. The majority goes a bit textualist here. They say it is immediately apparent using practically any dictionary that contiguous means touching or in actual contact. So that is the basis of the decision. They do acknowledge that previous court rulings have said that pieces of a municipality are politically contiguous, even if they might not be geographically contiguous. And interesting because they also acknowledge that the reason for the contiguous requirement, again, this is the majority, is that it makes for districts that are more geographically cohesive and therefore more likely to reflect a reasonably homogeneous slate of interests than districts with scattered pockets of isolated communities. And the reason I think this is interesting is, Kim, you can make the argument both ways. If you're trying to create a district that contains people who share interests and political interests, is it better to have a district that includes contiguous territory, even if it excludes pieces of the municipality that is in that territory? Or is it better to go with this kind of politically contiguous hedge? And so the district that contains Racine includes all of Racine, even if there's a bit that's floating out in a different district.
I mean, the arguments that they put forward in this opinion certainly sound soothing. They make it sound as though this is all preferable to the current status quo. But as Colin pointed out, I think the history suggests that this has never been a problem in the past for the High Court. Not only has the court voted for this sort of situation for decades, and not only is there a practical point about how these districts and these islands, as it were, have so few voters that they don't really have a discernible impact on elections. The three of the members of the current progressive majority have voted to uphold these maps in the past. So it's odd now that they are suddenly changing their mind and saying that this is all taboo and that it must be done in a different way. And I think what really highlights that this, in fact, looks to be a pretext is that while they have invalidated the maps on these reasons, and while in the beginning they claimed that they were not taking up this case due to claims that there was a partisan advantage for Republicans, their opinion makes very clear that when everybody comes back, and if indeed the court is now required to rewrite these maps itself, because they're going to give the legislature, the Republican legislature and Democratic Governor Tony Evers a chance to work this out, but they've maintained their own right to essentially do the maps themselves if they want to. And they said that at that point, they would then look at the partisan impact and then held themselves up as all high and a lot of posturing about how they're not political and they'll have the ability to draw a more fair map than other people. But this was not why they supposedly took up this question. Yet they've made it very clear that they intend to pursue that route of pure flat out partisan questions if they end up withdrawing the maps or if they end up redrawing the maps in the end. And I think that that really highlights that this question of these non-contiguous or island districts really was a pretext to getting here, not the reason for doing it.
Colin, do you think the writing is on the wall here? Is there any chance? I mean, the context in Wisconsin is we have divided government. We have a Republican state house and a Democratic governor. Is there any chance that they now can come together and figure out some sort of replacement plan? Or is the practical effect here that Wisconsin is probably going to end up with some kind of map that is drawn by the judiciary?
I think that's right. I think the real issue here is that although that may be the most likely outcome, that the Supreme Court ends up drawing these maps, there's no question as well that the progressive justices are in some ways twisting arms to encourage any Republicans in the legislature to do what they can to come around to maps that Tony Evers would prefer, because, of course, if no decision is reached, then the alternative is for the progressive justices to help draw the maps. And we already know what that's going to look like. I mean, the issue that Kim was mentioning, I think, was really egregious. I mean, Justice Jill Karofsky, who wrote the opinion for the majority, specifically said, hey, look, we decided not to address this claim on extreme partisan gerrymandering. Even though we thought it presented an important and unresolved legal question, we declined to address it due to the need for extensive fact-finding. That's what she said, right? And then she turns around and says, well, but even though we actually decided not to address that question, that doesn't mean that we're going to ignore partisan impact as we adopt these remedial maps. So that's really a very frustrating and non-judicial way to come at this, as if we didn't really already realize that they're primarily proceeding on the politics. But I just wanted to talk about one other thing, which is that the way these political districts are typically drawn as we look at the gerrymandering question, everyone says, well, Republicans gerrymandered these maps before, and that's very obvious because they hold more legislative districts than they do in terms of their sort of raw political majority in the state. And this is something that exists in many states, but I think is particularly true in Wisconsin because the progressive votes and liberal Democratic votes are all deeply, intensely concentrated in Milwaukee and Madison. So when you think of drawing, a political map and you want it to look fair and you want it to look basically like a checkerboard across a state, if you do that, you're going to end up with what is just the Republicans' natural geographical advantage, right? It's a mostly red state with very intense population centers in Milwaukee and Madison that are Democrats. So if you want to draw a map that somehow divides equally between Republicans and Democrats in Wisconsin, what you're going to essentially have to have is a map that has two spiders in the middle of it, right? You're going to have these legs of Democrats extending out from the population centers in Milwaukee and Madison that somehow scoop people into those districts. So how they're going to redraw these maps in a way that is somehow fair and not making drastic, intentionally partisan changes from what we had before is going to be very, very challenging.